Hello, I just want to do a quick video on Noam Chomsky and essentially just some of his ideas and some of the things he gets wrong. And some of the things he gets right. He gets a lot of stuff right. So Noam Chomsky, if you read his books, he sounds a lot like Andrew Breitbart. Andrew Breitbart, would talk a lot about how, hey, the media is all colluding, how, there's this big conspiracy, how these people have, very, very radical beliefs outside of the mainstream, what your average American would believe. And the media is hiding stuff, lying, purposely trying to direct the narrative rather than just report on reality and what's going on. And this is something that, a lot of, I think it's a real failure by the people who like Noam Chomsky, that they don't point this out, that they don't try and co-opt or work together with, I should say, Andrew Breitbart's constituency. The Breitbarts, the Mike Cernoviches, even Stefan Molyneux's, people who are more skeptical of what's going on, and then just present, because there's only a few points where Noam Chomsky might even deviate from these other people. And Noam Chomsky, I just finished a book by him, and one of the most frustrating things about the way he writes books or conducts interviews or presents ideas is that he will have a footnote that is 1,238 pages long. No joke. So, for example, he'll say, "Oh yeah, it was in this memorandum," and then you'll say, "Okay, well, you'll dig through the internet, try and find this memorandum, you'll find it, and it's over 1,000 pages long." It's like, well, do you really expect me to read this whole 1,000 pages in order to verify your point? So, it's a super frustrating thing for him to do, and it's extremely unpersuasive. He has very few people are persuaded by Noam Chomsky, and he just seems to say, well, that's life, most people are sucked in by the dominant culture and the dominant ideology, and that's all you can do. It's not all you can do. The big thing about Noam Chomsky is, so for example, when he talks about libertarians or American libertarians or capitalism in general, he'll say a lot in his interviews, capitalism will never work. It would fail in about 10 minutes. And it's like, well, could you present a reason why? Or people in the 1930s, everyone knew capitalism had failed and was a joke and would never come back. Well, yeah, I mean, that's what libertarians say too. People in the 1930s were very, very left-wing. Intellectuals thought that socialism was the way. That's the whole point. That's why we got FDR. They were wrong. People thought that after World War II, we would go into a larger depression, much larger than the Great Depression, and that didn't happen. A lot of the things Noam Chomsky says aren't necessarily wrong, but he's viewing them at a different angle from from either the dominant ideology, as he calls it, or, libertarians, for example. So just as far as, capitalism and, capitalism being dead in the 1930s, yes, a lot of countries, a lot of leaders, a lot of, you'd say, the ivory tower types, thought capitalism was dead. Socialism, why would you allow people to direct their own resources when you can control society's resources as you see fit? And obviously you know more than those people, so why shouldn't you be the one to direct society's resources? It's a very logical, if you have just a basic model of the world, it's a very logical thing to do and think, that, why are we wasting all this money on, X, Y, and Z and profits, and, hey, what if we just reinvested those profits into more things for people? Then we could reduce poverty and increase happiness. Society is extremely complex. And so the problem with socialists is most of them have this very simplistic model of economies and of societies. A lot of times they will use analogies to the family. Well, you wouldn't let your kid starve to death, so, therefore we should redistribute all your income. That's, obviously not what they say, but a lot of times, especially with Noam Chomsky, it is this much simpler view of how the economy works, and he doesn't really try to tackle the best arguments that capitalists have. And for example, Noam Chomsky, when confronted with the Soviet Union, said, "Oh, that was clearly not socialism." they had huge bureaucracy. They used a lot of violence. This, that, the other. It was actually much closer to what the United States has than it was to real socialism. Yes, that's the point, Noam Chomsky. The point is that, that F.A. Hayek, for example, made in The Road to Serfdom was that in order to fix inequalities of wealth, you first have to create massive inequalities of power. And once those inequalities of power exist, it is very difficult, incredibly difficult, impossible for good outcomes to to occur. Once those inequalities of power, once you give a central authority or a group of people all of the power in society, or enough power to redistribute wealth, they're going to redistribute it to themselves. They're going to give themselves all the wealth. It's a very dangerous situation. That's why socialism, or pursuing socialism, is the road to serfdom. Now, a lot of these interviews I've seen with him are in the past, before the 2008 financial crisis, actually even before September 11th. But one of the things you have to keep in mind when going over, Noam Chomsky's life's work, is that, look, for example, the kibbutzim, or the kibbutz, they are socialist little enclaves within, basically within Israel, and they're very religious, and they essentially have a socialist model. In, as close to anything, as close to a socialist society as you could imagine, that's what they have. And Noam Chomsky says, see, it works. There's some cultural things that go on. There's this, there's that. But socialism obviously works because of the kibbutz. And then in 2008, what happened was all of them went under, or a ton of them dissolved themselves. From the time when Noam Chomsky was talking about them to, today. And the ones that were more religious are the ones who were able to weather the storm. Because essentially what was happening was that these different socialist enclaves were pulling in resources from the capitalist economy, the much larger capitalist economy. And so they were essentially being subsidized. And the way we know this is because, money today, if you take a loan, is borrowed against, future earnings. It turns out those future earnings didn't exist. The kibbutz were never able to produce enough to, take into account their past consumption. So that's what default is. So these kibbutz after kibbutz defaulted because essentially they couldn't survive on their own. They needed credit. They needed an infusion of capital from a capitalist system. And number two, they were not able to produce enough in the future to pay off these, past subsidies. So it's just another story of, at the time, people will always point to a socialist paradise and say, see, it works great. Socialism works great. We should be more like that. But then, of course, it doesn't last. And once it fails, people say, well, they'll just move on to the next one. A lot of times there's no discussion. Noam Chomsky has never really tackled this problem, that for decades he was talking about the kibbutz being a great model of socialism, and then once they fail, he never, seriously talks about, well, maybe this is proof that socialism does not work. And I mentioned earlier that, the more religious the kibbutz, the more likely it was to survive. The reason this might be the fact that, if you are a religious person, you are more willing to sublimate your desires, your needs as an individual, as a human, for the group. And that's what a lot of religions tell you, that, kibbutz can only work with extreme ideology enforced and in place. And even this is a maybe. It doesn't seem like, because, socialism ideology, and a lot of these kibbutz were extremely socialist, and that didn't seem to work. But it seems like, look, there are certain religions which may lend themselves to having people sublimate their desires and their instincts and their wants and their needs, which, again, even that is a little gross. Even that is a little dystopian, because a lot of humans want children. A lot of, especially, stereotypically speaking, a lot more women really have a connection with their children. A lot of these kibbutz, children were essentially owned collectively. They were raised collectively. Essentially because that way, everyone shared resources and blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of reasons why you would want to. But yeah, children were essentially shared resources, or were raising a child was shared among the group, which is not what most people want to do. Most people don't want to take care of a baby that may or may not be theirs, or they know is someone else's. They want to take care of a child that is their own. They have an emotional attachment not just to a baby, but to that particular baby. Anyways, long story short, I think Noam Chomsky does himself a huge disservice by not ever really explaining, not ever tussling with Rothbard or Hayek and their ideas. I mean, he really just proves their points over and over again. I also think it's a mistake of modern day, people who love Noam Chomsky today to not really tussle with Andrew Breitbart. I think there's a lot of common ground there. And all these Antifa types, I mean, of course, some of them are, government patsies, but the ones who are not, the ones who really believe it, they need to go and start working for Andrew Breitbart. They need to start, I'm sure you can have a left-wing, Breitbart is essentially they're a conservative website, but they're huge media critics. And you can create a left-wing version of that. Anyways, long story short, I'm already 11 minutes in. I guess the only other thing about Noam Chomsky is, he just kind of resigns himself to nothing. Essentially, you'll never get this, you'll never get that. He's very pessimistic, when in fact he should be incredibly optimistic. He should be encouraging people. Hey, let's try this. Let's try the kibbutz in the United States. Let's do this. Let's do that. Let's build these systems we have today. Noam Chomsky talks a lot about the political system. Yes, if you're waiting for a supermajority to vote out the powerful, you're never gonna get it. Because even when you do get that supermajority, even when you do vote out the powerful, the people doing the redistributing of wealth are just gonna redistribute the wealth to themselves. As Noam Chomsky points out, in the Soviet Union, even when right as these communists got into power, the first thing they did was oppress and kill and exterminate other lines of thinking, other intellectuals who maybe disagreed with them. You've got other ideas that were competing against them. That's what's going to happen in the United States too. If we get a supermajority of people who want to vote out the billionaires, what you're going to end up getting is people redistributing that money and using that power to destroy the people who voted for them, or at least their leaders and their ideological figureheads, stuff like that. They're just going to go and just start stomping on everyone. So have a great day. If you have any questions, please put them down in the chat. Please leave a like and a subscribe if you see this. Thank you so much and have a great day. Bye.